Tonight, our agenda, David Stoney will be starting. He's going to talk for about an hour, and when he's finished making his presentation, we'll have a break. We're going to put some wine out. There's food back there, and then we'll just maybe take about 15 minutes. You can also look at the beautiful photography that David brought with him, and then we'll come back together and have discussion and question and answers. And so please don't leave thinking that we're finished at 6 o'clock. Restrooms are through that door underneath the clock back there. And any questions or, anything, just please ask somebody at the back table there. So today we're welcoming S. David Stoney, PhD. I don't know David very well, but I really enjoyed preparing to bring this program to fruition today. He's a delightful person, and I'm really fascinated by his academic career, how he teaching and writing about physiology and neuroscience, and how that was informed by his personal journey and has now been integrated and evolved into the presentation that we're going to have tonight. We have a good amount of information about David on our website, so I'm not going to go through all the details, but know that we have a beautiful voice and an experienced person who's going to be sharing with us tonight. His topic has implications for all of us, I think, and lots of food for thought. So I mentioned that David brought some of his photographs. They are for sale. His photography is called Loco Photography by S. David Stoney, based in McClellanville. And so either at the break or whenever, definitely don't miss taking a look at the photographs. David, come on up and let's hear what you have to say. I wanted to save most of the time for you.
Well, hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Betsy, thank you so much for your introduction, your kind introduction. Appreciate that very much. Thanks also to the board of the Charleston Jung Society for inviting me to speak. And particular thanks to all of you all for coming out. You honor me with your presence. Thank you for being here, and I hope I'll say a few things at least that are interesting to you. And before I go ahead and get started, I want to say a special thanks to the late John Johnson, who was a favorite member of the Charleston Jung Society group. I met John about 2 years ago at a talk that was given here. I wanted to talk to a psychoanalyst because I had thought of some things that I wanted to check out with a psychoanalyst. And someone said, well, John Johnson is a psychoanalyst. So I went up to John and I said, John, I'm David Stoney, and I wanted to talk to you. And he said, are you the David Stoney? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you used to live around the corner from me. And that was the absolute truth. It turned out John's younger brother, David Johnson, was one of my best friends when I was growing up in Charleston in the, that was the late 40s. And so I really appreciated John's encouragement, and we should blame him if this doesn't make any sense. So the figure that's been up on the screen is the Ouroboros. It's for me, it's a snake, or in this case, it looks like a fox eating its tail. And for me, it's a symbol that signifies a conjunction of beginnings and ends. And so this speech, this talk that I'm giving tonight, in fact, is is a particular end of a long journey that I've had in my life and that I'm going to describe to you, at least in part. And my beginnings were here in Charleston. I was born in Charleston. I grew up on Green Hill Street for a long time, and before moving to the country out near Rantols, and I'll talk about that some too. So the Ouroboros or Ouroboros is an ancient symbol. Eric Newman, for example, who wrote the wonderful book on the origin and history of consciousness, said that the Ouroboros represented the original primordial wholeness from which we all came, and that it corresponded to an evolutionary stage which can be recollected in the psychic structure of every human being. So the Ouroboros goes back, in fact, a long, long way. It describes our journey in our beginning of our journey in consciousness, and perhaps the end of our journey as well. The Sufi master Llewellyn von Lee described the development of consciousness as a journey from oneness to separation and duality, and then back again to oneness again. And the idea of being part of the oneness of the universe and of creation is very important, especially in the times that we're in today, because we're in a very unique time in both the human history and the climatic and geological history of the earth, and in our psychological history. And I ask you, if you will, to take a risk of relaxing the spatiotemporal boundaries on your feeling state. Our feelings are naturally focused close to us in space and in time. Our families, our town, our in whatever group we're in. But right now we need, I think, to expand those boundaries both into the past, and I'll be talking about that some, as well as definitely into the future of letting ourselves feel for future generations in the future, and B, for our hominid ancestors in the past. And so keep that in mind. Be open to maybe some new ideas. So the title of my talk is In These Last Days, Apocalypse versus Wholeness. And that's a figure from Duer, four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that's a picture of a sunrise at Folly Beach, actually, that I took some time ago, and let that represent a wholeness and a new dawn, perhaps, for our consciousness and for our civilization. Lord knows we need one. I went one too far there. What I want to do tonight then is cover some early experience, namely my experience as a young boy when my mother was killed in an automobile wreck. Then later, an experience of powerful alteration in consciousness I had as a young man when I was teaching and doing research at the Medical College of Georgia. And I set out on a search to figure out what that change in consciousness could possibly have been caused by and what it meant. And that was a long search. It led me to the evolution of the human species. It led me to the notion of archetypes, one of Jung's most important notions. And I'll speak at the end about what it means for us today. A prelude. It was 1950, April of 1950 to be exact. I was being driven home by some friends of the family, though we had moved to Rand Holes out on the inland waterway, and I was being driven home. There was to be a party that night at our house in the country. However, none of my family returned home that night, and on the way home, I had been driven past the scene of a terrible automobile accident. There were police cars, ambulances, crowds of people, and didn't know what it was. The next morning, I was driven into town by the friends of the family. I learned my mother had been killed in that very accident that we had passed on the highway. This was an incredible shock for me. It was terrifying. I had no idea what to do. I had grief, but I didn't feel that grief. I covered it up with what I've described in the past as a blue-white anger at God. How was it possible that the God of my understanding, a 10-year-old boy's understanding, God who controls everything and lives up in the sky, how was it possible that he could have allowed my mother to have been killed? I was not just angry, I was full of rage, and that anger and that separation from God was to last for a long time and was to influence the course of my life in a number of ways. And then the next thing which happened was this alteration in consciousness that I spoke of. And this was not associated with any particular herbal medicines or other drugs of any kind. This happened one night. My ex-wife had come over rather late at night, knocking on the door. She wanted to vent and complain. I did not really want that to happen, but I said, okay, come in. And in the midst of a conversation with her, I had this sudden brightening of consciousness. It was like something. It's like nothing I had ever had before. It was very powerful. It was an irrefutable knowing that something very important was about to happen very soon. Only trouble was I didn't have a clue what that something was. However, whatever it was, the feeling was that it was imminent. It was going to happen right away. And this was a persistent, compelling feeling that stayed with me, and to some extent is still with me, I think. For a year, it stayed with me for a very long time, but I didn't have a clue as to what it was. I felt obliged, though, to share the information, and I actually went to my departmental chairman, that was Bob Little, went to the dean of the Medical College of Georgia to tell them that something very big and important was about to happen, but I didn't know what it was. Those were kind of uncomfortable meetings. Those Bob and Fair Goodale was the dean. They were very, very nice folks, and they didn't put me away. I went to a psychiatrist about it, and this was after I had. I said they must, whatever this thing was, it had to be very big. Maybe it was a premonition of my own death. No, it's much, much bigger than that. Much, much bigger than that. And so I made a conscious decision that, well, maybe I'd have some kind of premonition of a imminently pending global catastrophe, an end of the world. I went to the psychiatrist I went to about that. He was not a Jungian. He said, well, aren't you glad it's just a feeling, David? A humanities counselor at the college I went to said, David, they're not supposed to be any more prophets. Okay. Well, none of that helped very much. I still had the feeling. And so that was 1976 that happened. By 1982, I had gotten really tired of expecting the end of the world, of a global catastrophe. And my idea was it was going to be some natural cause. Well, Gribben and Pageman, I think it is, wrote a book about the grand alignment of the planets, published in 1982, and the planets were going to line up in the solar system, and there were going to be terrible earthquakes and floods and catastrophes, and that, I said, that's it, that is it. And so I pinned my feeling about the end of the world onto that. Well, nothing happened. Nothing happened, but what did happen for me, it took some of the energy away from that, and so it wasn't as bothersome to have had this change, alteration, this powerful alteration in consciousness. It wasn't as bothersome, and so I spent the next 20 or 30 years so just paying attention to, well, what on earth could have caused that? What could have done it? And early on there, I had the image of being on the back of a very large tiger that was running very fast, and that I figured the best thing to do was to hold on as tight as I could and see what would happen. And I did that. So as I said, nothing happened in 1982 when the planets all lined up. And so that led me to realize that I had been wrong, that my sense of an imminent global catastrophe was wrong. And that sense that came with that altered state of consciousness, that powerful altered state of consciousness, was wrong. But so what the heck was it? What could have caused me to think that? And so I was looking for that for a long while. And in the course of that looking, paying attention, trying to understand things, trying to understand the brain and behavior, I had to weave together 3 strands of thought. And those strands of thought are the evolution of the human species during the Earth's climate cycling. I'll get into the detail of that in a minute. The significance of that in terms of our psychic development, and then the notion of archetypes. And I was able to weave those 3 strands into what is to me a coherent story. I hope it will be for you too. So let's look at the evolutionary bit first. Step aside for a minute. Can you hear me in the back? The human species began to evolve from our ape and chimpanzee forebears around 2.5 to 3 million years ago. And that's exactly the time that the Earth's climate started cycling, first at a 41,000 year period, then later, as now, at a 100,000 year cycle. And that data is from the oxygen-18 isotope concentrations in the shells of plankton recovered from deep sea cores. And it's pretty well accepted. And so that 2.5, 3 million years ago, the time when the first hominids, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, separated from the ape-chimpanzee line. That's the brain size for apes and chimpanzees. You can point it over here too. That's the ape-chimpanzee brain size. And Homo erectus, upright hominids, are in the circles. the brain size increased progressively from 2.5 million years ago up to the present time when we achieved what the brain size we have now. And that 3 million year long period of climate cycling was a time of extraordinary difficulty. It was a extinction-threatening time during the cold periods for the hominids. And during the short warm periods, which were only about 12 to 15,000 years, whereas the cold periods were 100,000 years, it was a bust-boom cycle that repeated for thousands of generations of our hominid ancestors. Now, here's where I want you to let your spatiotemporal boundary of your feelings extend. The hominids were not mindless, feelingless robots. They were living creatures with a growing brain and were capable of themselves feeling. So they experienced and lived through boom-bust cycle after boom-bust cycle after boom-bust cycle. And that period was really, really tough. The northern hemisphere during the glacial phases, the 100,000-year-long glacial phases, were mostly covered either with ice sheets, or were desert or semi-desert, reddish and brown, desert and semi-desert. So conditions for life were very, very difficult during the cold 100,000-year-long cold phases. And yet somehow our hominid ancestors adapted. And in fact, adapting to those difficult conditions is what has led to our increased brain growth, has led to us today being Homo sapiens today with pretty big brains. So I look at this period of 2.5 million years of hominid ancestors going through generation after generation of boom-bust cycles. I look at that as having left a scar on the human psyche, and that process was the birthing process for the human species, the birthing process for the human species. So we know from a number of psychoanalysts that birthing is a traumatic process for the not only for the mother perhaps, but certainly for the infant as well. Freud thought that the birth process was the original origin of anxiety. Otto Rank wrote a whole book about the birth trauma, thought that most psychopathology was related to it. He tried to relate everything to it. Stanislav Grof used breathing techniques, holotropic breath work, and LSD doses to get back to what he calls systems of condensed experience that surrounded the birth process. And he had 4 stages of experience associated with the pre-birth, intrauterine to post-birth. And then Christopher Bosch followed Grof's work and even found what he thought was systems of condensed experience deep in the psyche that related to the collective unconscious, to the species mind. So that tied then the birthing process of the human species for me to birth trauma and to a impact on the psyche of the human species. And then what I finally needed to put all this together was the notion of archetypes. And archetypes are one of Jung's most useful and rich concepts. Archetypes may be a little bit too rich. They seem to be archetypes for almost everything. But there's one in particular that I'll end up talking about. Archetypes are for behavior what river channels are for the flow of water. So just as a river channel guides the flow of water, so an archetype from within the psyche will guide behavior, thought, and action. And Jung said that they are present in every psyche, that they preform and continually influence our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Edward Edinger, a student of Jung and author of the Archetype of the Apocalypse, and I'll get to that in a moment, said it's a pattern, a primordial psychic ordering, a dynamic agency. Anthony Stevens, who recently wrote Archetypes Revisited, said that they are innate neuropsychic centers that mediate common behavioral characteristics and typical experiences. I think a simple definition of an archetype is an innate behavioral disposition with intention. So archetypes have intention. Let me give you an example, the mother archetype, for example. Think what you would do if you were in the city and you rounded a corner and there in the middle of a wide sidewalk was an infant all by itself sitting on the sidewalk and crying. Well, what would you do? I think the immediate reaction, especially for women, would be to approach the infant to make sure it was okay. Man might react a little differently. They might first look around. Well, where's the caretaker for this infant? But that's a natural reaction to that context, and that's a kind of archetype. The hero archetypes, victim archetypes, the archetypes for very many behaviors. But there's one in particular that we want to talk about tonight. It's the, well, let's see, I haven't gotten there quite yet. So where do they come from? Jung was quite specific about this. They come from the repeated experience of humanity. And that ties in perfectly with the notion then of the repeated trauma of the birth process for our species. And their origin can only be explained by assuming them to be the deposit of the constantly repeated experience of humanity. And that makes good sense. And the one we want to talk about in particular, and which I think was important in my case and has been important in the historical era, is the archetype of the apocalypse. Now, apocalypse from the original Greek means to uncover what was hidden. But in the Judeo-Christian West, certainly since Jesus' time, the apocalypse has been associated with a catastrophic end time, where there'll be a revelation to a prophet, the people are then judged, and then the bloody battle of good and evil, and the good vanquishes, you know, of course. And then there's eternal peace and perhaps renewal. The archetype of the apocalypse, we know it well from the book of Revelation in the Christian Bible. But the archetype of the apocalypse has been around for a long, long time. And there's a, oops, sorry. There was an Assyrian tablet from about estimated 2000 BC that said, conditions have deteriorated terribly. The end must be near. Zoroaster in about 1500 BC was certain there would be a battle between good and evil and a final end time. The Old Testament prophets from around 900 to around 150 BC, Isaiah, Daniel, especially Ezekiel, all were predicting a end time of some sort. Now, a prophet doesn't just come to predict an end time. That's just part of what a prophecy might be. They came to remind the people of the need to return to God and to the laws of the community and to responsibility. So it wasn't just about the end time. The New Testament prophets. Now, that's where the title of my talk came from. In these last days is a direct quote from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. And it refers to the widespread belief around Jesus' time that there would be a second coming and an end time, he said in Matthew 24, within a generation. And that there would be terrible tribulation such as no one had ever seen before. And that it was going to happen very, very soon. And then the book of Revelation in the Christian Bible is remarkable. John, the author of that, who's probably not John, the disciple of Jesus, but a John, he said that the things that he would describe would be happening soon. So there's this sense of imminency that were there, and then in the Crusades that began in around 1095 with Pope Urban II, they were quite remarkable. I went to Stoney for my freshman year in college, University of the South, and one of my courses was a world history course. And at that time, Stoney was all male. And the professors wore academic gowns, black, long academic gowns. And my professor came into the room and his gown was open, whirled around, gown flowed out. And he said, "Gentlemen, if you wish to understand the time you're living in, you will study the period around the first millennium." And when Pope Urban II he gathered prelates together and priests and noblemen and everybody he could to try to get the group together for the First Crusade. And his charisma was such that the whole audience was spellbound. They were begging to be taken, to be allowed to participate in the First Crusade. They were saying, "Dus le vote," the will of God, the will of God. And I think that too was an example of the activation of the archetype of the apocalypse. And so in Anthony Stevens' book and in Edward Edinger's books, the structure of the archetypes of the apocalypse is pretty straightforward. Come over to this side. There's a profound alteration in consciousness that may be revelatory. It maybe numinous. The person may think it was a call from God. It's certainly awesome. It's irresistible, and the feeling is irrefutable. It has a notion of an imminent end time is often associated with it. There's intention that it's supposed to be talked about, and there's power and obligation, charisma, and it's contagious. It gets to the people around the prophet, and the prophet may feel he or she was selected. Now, my experience as a young man, when I was 36 or so in Augusta, Georgia, at the Medical College of Georgia, I had a profound alteration in consciousness. It was awesome. I didn't feel that it was divinely produced. It was revelatory. Something new that I didn't know anything about was there. Something huge and big was about to happen, so it was imminent. It was something imminent. And I was supposed to share my information about it. And my pointer just died. And that's all right. And I felt the obligation to share it. I went to my departmental chairman, to the dean of the medical school, to the humanities counselor, and all of that. And so it struck me that what had happened to me was I had had activation of the archetype of the apocalypse, the so-called archetype of the apocalypse. And but I had concluded that an imminent end to the world was not going to happen. Okay. And guess what? All the prophets that have predicted an imminent end to the world have been wrong. I don't think the world has ended. If I didn't notice it, if it did. But the notion of an imminent ending is erroneous. It's not to say there's not a profound, and who knows, in some cases, a God-given call to the prophet. But it's a call to have the community wake up, I think. And so what I came to realize then was I put the three strands of thought together about our human evolution. And I thought that indeed I had experienced the activation of the archetype of the apocalypse. I think my experience as a young man with mother's death, my anger towards God had inoculated me, in a sense, from a religious interpretation, and probably saved my life. I think I would have made a terrible prophet. How could that be possible? I was angry at God. I didn't have any relationship with God. I would have made a perfectly awful prophet. So I didn't, of course, know that when it happened. It was only in the late 90s and early 2000s that I began putting all this together. And so I've concluded that that what had happened to me was not a divine message from God, but instead was a message about the danger of and the effects of our evolution during our birthing process, during the Earth's climate cycling, and that our hominid ancestors were, with their growing brains, were exposed to that boom-bust cycle over and over and over again. It was a repeating trauma, interrupted, granted, with periods of warm periods, short warm periods, very long cold periods that threatened extinction. I believe it left a scar on the human psyche. And that scar on the human psyche manifests today as the archetype of the apocalypse. And so it was a birth trauma, if you will, that was ever forgotten from generation to generation, it was forgotten, and yet it was ever remembered in the deepest parts of our brain, namely in the collective unconscious of our species. And so all these, the three strands of thought converged. I think the notion that there's going to be a divinely orchestrated end time, at least as predicted by the archetype of the apocalypse, I don't think that's going to occur. So it was not a portent, if you will, of a divinely orchestrated end of the world. Rather, I think it was a call to action, a warning from nature, or God, if you will, about the onset of the next ice age, that it activates towards the end of a warm period to tell us to get ready, to prepare. It calls for action, preparation, and cooperation. Now, how does it get our attention? It gets our attention by heightening our anxiety. And Lord knows, anxiety broils the 21st century mindscape, if anything does. I mean, it's everywhere you look. People are nervous, uncertain, and I thought the Edward Munch, The Scream of Nature, the original title, was appropriate to signify that. And anxiety is a debilitating thing. It's a debilitating thing for our children. It's a debilitating thing for us as adults in the sense that anxiety and fear breed intolerance. And my goodness gracious, is that rampant today, the intolerance that we see around us in our society. So what I think is that the archetype of the apocalypse was a warning from nature, warning us that the next ice age was about to begin. And so it's appropriate to have anxiety. It's a gift, in a sense, from nature, well, perhaps from God. But today, we've put enough extra heat into the atmosphere, into the Earth's climate system, to prevent us from going into another ice age for a long, long time, for the foreseeable future, as a matter of fact. So nature, doesn't know a thing about civilization. Nature doesn't know anything about the internal combustion engine. And so we get this archetype that's been activating during this historical period, during this warm period of the Earth's cycling climate, to warn us about the next ice age. But, well, today there's not going to be another ice age. Nevertheless, paradoxically, I think the archetype of the apocalypse has great meaning for today. We are at the end of a unique period, namely what should be this warm period. We are also at the end of what may be the business and politics as usual, because business and politics as usual seems to be suicidal, at least with the current leadership that we have in our country. And that archetype calls not only to warn us, but to awaken us to the need to take action and to cooperate. Now, paradoxically, it may be indicating a catastrophic apocalypse. two dinosaurs talking together and one saying to the other, well, now I think it's time to develop the technology to deflect an asteroid. You know, an asteroid supposedly had killed the dinosaurs. Well, they didn't have the technology and the know-how to do that, of course. Today, we do. We've survived an extraordinary birth process. We are a resilient species capable of adapting to enormous hardship and difficulties. We have the technological know-how to prevent a catastrophic apocalypse from happening. But the train has gotten a bit off the track. This was from Dilbert in the Post and Courier just a few days ago. And Dilbert saying that we're approaching a parity inversion point. And he says that occurs when reality becomes so absurd that you can't distinguish it from parody. And and his friend says, well, maybe the government can fix it. Well, in today's world, I'm afraid that the government, as Ronald Reagan said, is not the solution. It's part of the problem. It should be part of the solution, but it's actually part of the problem today. We have a leadership failure at the highest levels in our country I asked you to extend your feeling function out to our hominid ancestors and consider that they had feelings, that they could have experiences that would have an effect on their psyche. The other direction is for the future generations. We are the ancestors for future generations. We need to extend our feelings out towards them too, because our current leadership seems to have given up on any kind of justice or protection or from out-of-control climate change for future generations. And they don't pay attention to science. They either don't believe in global warming or think it's too costly to approach, or just don't give a damn. It may be that fear and greed are directing their activities. But our country led the world in per capita greenhouse gas emissions for many, many decades. And to me, that means we have a particular responsibility to try to deal with the issue of global warming, which results from those greenhouse gases. And apparently that is not the case in our current leadership. So with that leadership, if a alien spaceship were to come to destroy the Earth, they could kind of sit around and not bother, because we'd be doing it, the way things are going now, we're doing it to ourselves. So there is a catastrophic apocalypse that is underway as we speak. And it's going to be unjust. It's going to be dramatic unless we can make some real changes, unless we can respond to the call of the archetype to awaken and go deeper, and knowing our own unconscious and knowing our own past, knowing the origins of the anxiety that is so rampant in our society. We can do that. And I don't have my pointer, but on this infrared picture of our state of South Carolina, there are two little arrows up near where the label South Carolina is. They're pointing to the fall line of our state. Everything, ocean side of that is coast. about half of South Carolina would disappear in the next couple of centuries if we continue on the current path of denying science and not extending our feeling function to future generations. Our children's children and their children will have a very, very difficult time. So this apocalyptic imagery doesn't have to turn out badly. It can turn out well if we are willing to integrate, according to Jung, our ego function and some of our collective unconscious, the deeper layers of our psyche. And if we don't do that, then the apocalypse will turn out catastrophically. If we're open, though, to the information that's being brought forward as this archetype activates, and you know, it doesn't have to activate where you suddenly feel like the end of the world is here. It can activate a little bit, I think. I think archetypes can be a little bit, or they can be a lot. They're not always all or none. But if we are open and cooperates with what Jung called the coming of the self, the coming of the whole person, then we will be able to take the kinds of action that will change the trajectory that we're currently on. And so I think this is indeed a very unique time. It's unique geologically, it's unique climatically, it's unique psychologically. We are at the end of the Earth's, what should be the end of the Earth's short, warm, wet, interglacial phase. This archetype is activating in part or in whole all around us. Anxiety is high. And it is time for us to be, even though I know all of us may be working as hard as we can already on dealing with issues, but it's time to open up more, I think. It's, and I think that it's a time where our spiritual health will be very, very important. That sense of connection to the original primordial oneness from which we came. It is, that provides a sense of safety, a sense of peace that is, will be really necessary in the times that are ahead. We don't have to have a damn catastrophic apocalypse. We don't have to wipe out half of South Carolina with sea level rise and climate change. We can move towards a more sustainable, more equitable, more just society, but it's going to take some work and some changes, I think. The next to last slide is again the Ouroboros, that primordial wholeness from which we have come and to which we'll ultimately return. I had some music to go with that, but it didn't make the transfer between my MacBook Pro and the Windows operating system. Sorry about that. But so we can move towards a more whole state psychologically for us. It would be wonderful to snap our fingers and have it happen for our state and our country, but of course that's not going to happen. But there are things that we can do, and I wanted to leave you with these. One of the things we can do is to come to next month's talk with Jerry Wright here with the Charleston Jung Society, because Jerry is talking about a new image of God in religion. And he says it's the most critical aspect of things that we can address today. I've spoken with Jerry Wright and shared some work with him. And I expect that'll be a wonderful presentation. So that addresses the spiritual aspect of things. Work on relaxing the boundaries of your feelings. Open to the primordial wholeness. Find a convivial group. Maybe it's the Charleston Jung Society. Maybe it's a group with Stephen Weinberg, mentioned in item 8 there. He does South Carolina climate. You want to be kept up on things going on about climate change in the state and in the nation, you can link up with his group. What about the kids? I mean, there's high anxiety, and anxiety influences children in many ways. So I think it's critical to talk to children and let them try to help them understand the nature of the times that we live in. So we can't save the world or even the country, but we actually can work to save Charleston and South Carolina. And so, again, I think getting active is going to be important. It's not going to be, is important. And let's don't vote for anyone who seems to implicitly or explicitly accept the notion of a nihilistically absurd country, city, state, or world. That is not going to be the thing to do. Don't vote for someone like that, for goodness sake. Now, we're going to have hard times. There's enough heat built into the climate system to cause sea level to rise, 3 feet by the end of the 21st century? Maybe more. We can avoid the worst hard times, though, if we accept the call to opening from the archetype. I have a handout at the back table with some references and links that you could take on your way out. Again, I recommend Steve Weinberg's group for keeping up with climate change. And I emphasize the climate change, A, because it is a real emergency, and B, because it influences everything else. It multiplies all the other problems that we have. So we live at an extraordinary time. We are an extraordinary species living in an extraordinary time. We face a call to move beyond business and politics as usual, and to, as best we can, try to change the trajectory of where we're going. And to me, that's what the archetype of the apocalypse is telling us about in these last days. And I thank you for your attention. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back for questions and comments after the break. So thank you very much for your attention.